invitation and the Ramakrishna Mission Institute for hosting it today. The topic is New Latin America, what it means for India. But before going into the topic, I could not resist the temptation of making some comparison between Latin America and Bengal. And Bengal, Kolkatta, and point out some similarities and links between Latin America and your region. I will mention just three of them: football, communism, and taboo. Taboo. Football, I know you are the leaders in India, the craze for both football, and Latin Americans are the global leaders crazy about football. I was told that the crowds in Kolkatta were crazy when Maradona visited here in 2008. The rivalry between Mohan Bagan and East Bengal reminds me of the rivalry between Boca Juniors and River Plate in Argentina, and Palmeiras and Corinthians in Brazil. In Latin America, they say fidelity and loyalty to the football team is more sacred than in marriage. In the beginning of my stay in Argentina, some of my friends took me to the Bombonera Stadium, the famous stadium of Boca Juniors, and made me as a fan of Boca Juniors, and made me to take oaths. They said, you can change your religion, political party, or spouse, but not this football team. So I have become an eternal fan of Boca Juniors. Next is communism. I know, after 34 years of Marxist rule, you are in a post-Marxist stage in your society. The Latin Americans also claim that they are also in the post-Marxist stage, but in a different Latino way. They say, in the beginning, Moses stood on a mountain and said, God, you are everything. Without you, we are nothing. Then came King Solomon, put his hands together. Man, use your head. You can change the world. Then came Jesus, put his hands here. Heart, love thy neighbor. A lot of problems will be solved. And then came Karl Marx. If this is empty, there will be revolutions. And then came Sigmund Freud. So the Latin Americans say that they are in the most advanced stage of civilization, in the Freudian stage. Now, across Latin America, left is the most popular one. The region has turned left since about 2000. The majority of the governments are leftist, not communist, but leftist. And they are growing stronger and they have consolidated themselves. But in the beginning, in 2002, when it was popularized by Lula, there's a story about that. In one of the election campaigns, there was a little boy with a very expensive dress, and he was saying, vote for Lula. So Lula was very impressed, surprised. He went to him and said, hey son, I'm very happy that you are supporting me. May I ask you, what is the reason? Why do you support me? You seem to be from a rich family. So the boy says, my father is a rich businessman. He says, if you become president, you will ruin Brazil. And he says, if you become president, he will ship the family to Miami. And I love Miami. But now, Lula has got all the Miami money back to Brazil with his business-friendly policies. M. Roy, who you all know, was one of the founders of the Communist Party of Mexico. He went there in 1917 with his American wife. Initially, he was a socialist and then got converted to communism, and he founded communism. He was very active politically here. He gave lectures, he gave talks, he wrote books and articles about India. And when he left Mexico in 1919, the Mexican government gave him a diplomatic passport with the name Roberto Villa Garcia. And M. Roy called Mexico as the land of his rebirth. Today, the house where M. Roy lived is a vibrant nightclub and bar with the name M. Roy. The next is Tagore. Rabindranath Tagore was in Buenos Aires for 2 months, from November 1924 to January 25. Actually, he was going to Peru. He was invited there for the centenary celebrations. But he fell sick on the way. The doctors advised him to take rest and recuperate in Buenos Aires. And there, Victoria Ocampo, the elegant, young, and literary personality of Argentina, she came to receive him and spent her own money to hire a mansion and put him up over there and looked after him every day, introduced him to the local society, got him to write articles for the local newspapers. They used to meet every day. Then, after that, when he came back, they had extensive correspondence. There is a book called In Your Blossoming Garden by Keteki Kushari Daisy, which has a complete correspondence. And Tagore dedicated his Purabi poems to Victoria, calling her as Vijaya. And one of the poems, he says, exotic blossom, I whispered again in your ear, what is your language, dear? You smiled and shook your head, and the leaves murmured instead. It was an encounter not only between Tagore and Victoria Ocampo, it was an encounter between two cultures, two literary traditions and civilization. And it was also a bit personal. It was romantic and platonic. Tagore, who was 63 years old at the time, got rejuvenated when he met this young 34-year-old Argentine charming beauty Victoria Ocampo. And she, in her turn, got spiritually awakened and inspired. In the correspondence between the two, Tagore always writes, Dear Vijaya, my bolo basta. And Victoria, in her letters, she always wrote, Dear Gurudev, is the India TV. After these correspondence, they met in Paris in 1930. Victoria organized the first ever painting exhibition of Tagore using her money, her contacts and publicity. And in the last days of Tagore's life, he used to relax in a reclining chair in Shantiniketan, which was gifted by Victoria Oak. He even wrote a poem about that chair. Yes.
Can you sing that song? Chini jo chini tomare? That is the song.
And when he died, she sent a telegram to Tagore's son, Pensando en él, thinking of him. And this is the title of a movie which is being planned by a friend of mine from Argentina, a director called Pablo Cesar. He wants to make a movie about this Tagore-Victoria encounter with the title Thinking of Him. So if you know any producers, directors, please let me know. I met one yesterday and he was very interested. Now I'll come to the topic. New Latin America. Why New Latin America? Because the old Latin America was bad. It was in chaos, politically, economically, and socially. You had military coups, dictatorships, economic crises, social uncertainty, and unrest. But now, in the last about 2 decades, the region has undergone a paradigm shift. It has undergone a fundamental transformation, politically, economically, and culturally. The song of this new Latin America is No me preguntes más. Déjanos imaginar que no existe el pasado, que nacimos al mismo instante en que nos conocimos. In Spanish, it means, he understands that. It means, don't ask me anymore. Let us imagine that there was no past. Let us imagine that we were born when we met each other for the first time. So I tell people, particularly businessmen, when you want to do business with Latin America, throw away your history books, don't read. It's a new Latin. Politically, the region has become democracies. No more military coups, no more dictatorship. In this century, we had only 2 attempted coups. One in Venezuela in 2002, another one in Honduras in 2009. Both have been reversed immediately, and the civilian democratic rule is continuing. Democracy, although it is young and new in Latin America, as a reborn, has become more stable and strong. In the past, it was a top-down rule by oligarchs and generals. But now it is bottoms-up rule. The masses have been empowered, and they vote and they decide who would be their presidents and government. And they do even one better than what we do in India. When the governments and the presidents do not deliver, when they go astray, they bring down the government by mass protests and demonstrations. They did it in Brazil in 1992. The elected government of Collor was brought down. In Argentina, they did it in 2002. And Villarroa, we had to fly out of a helicopter from this king's palace because it was surrounded by masses. And they brought down 2-3 governments in Bolivia. Bolivia and Ecuador. And even now you read in the papers about the agitations against corruption in Brazil. So the masses have become empowered and they have made the rulers more accountable and more responsible, less adventurous and less experimentalist. Democracies are becoming more mature. In the past, there was this ideological polarization, the fight between left and right, liberals and conservatives, not just verbal and academic, but many hundreds of thousands of people got killed in civil wars across Latin America, Colombia, and Central America, many countries. But now, both the left and the right have become more pragmatic, more moderate, and more realistic. For example, you would think that this poverty alleviation program was funded by Lula, but it's called Bolsa Familia. Now, that program was actually implemented before that by the conservative PAN party in Mexico. In fact, the guy who did that called Santiago Levi, he was invited by Lula to do it in Brazil. So the conservatives have become more compassionate and the radical leftists have become more moderate and more pragmatic. And they are moving towards the center. And the best example of this political democratic maturity is what is called as Mexico Pact. You know, when the current president called Peña Nieto, when he was elected from his period, today Mexico is the only major large democracy in the world which has implemented so many major reforms in such a short while. That is democratic maturity. And not only mature, the Latin Americans, like in India, earlier they all fancied imported political economic models. Communism, Maoism, capitalism, neoliberalism, Washington consensus. But now they follow what this song says. Caminero no hay camino, se hace al andar, which means, O traveler, there is no path ahead. You make one when you walk. So the Latin Americans who tried all this capitalism, communism, imported ideologies, now they have evolved their own politico-economic model, which is called as Brasilia consensus, or some people call it as Lulaism. What is this? This is a judicious and balanced mix of pro-poor and pro-business policies. The leftist parties have realized that they alone, the government alone, cannot create all the wealth and provide jobs. So they need to give space for the private sector to create jobs and create wealth. So they let the private sector flourish so that they can tax them and use the money for pro-poor policies. So this is a perfect equilibrium. This is the ideal model for countries like India and most of the developing countries. Brasilia consensus or Lulaism. I would say it is about 60-40, 60% pro-poor and 40% pro-business. I'll talk about the new economy. The old economy had three curses: hyperinflation, excessive external debt, and instability of currencies and exchange rates. And in India, we cry for an inflation of 7-8%. But in 1989, Peru had an inflation of 11,000%. Brazil and Argentina had 3,000% inflation in the early 90s. In those days, the Brazilians, when they go to the bar, they will order 3 beers. Because by the time they order 1 beer, drink and finish, the second beer would have become more expensive. Those days the Argentines used to say that one can never say accurately the Latin American inflation or the Indian population. By the time you finish the sentence, both would have gone up. But now, in the last about 15 years, the average inflation of Latin America is in single digit. The only exception is Venezuela, which is over 60%, Argentina about 39%. Those are abnormal cases. The Latin Americans have decisively tamed the inflation, and they will never reach this hyperinflation area. Excessive external debt. The Latin Americans always spend more than they earn as part of the culture. So Argentina went into the world's largest debt default in 2000 to $90 billion. But today, the average ratio of external debt to GDP in Latin America is just 16%, 1/6. Whereas the ratio is over 100% in many European countries and even United States. So the Latin Americans have learned to live within their means, and they don't borrow externally. If they need money, they raise resources through local bonds. And the currencies and the exchange rates, which were also volatile, used to go up and down, now they become stabilized, they become predictable and stable. And the macroeconomic fundamentals of most of the countries have become solid and strong. In even the case of Bolivia, of Evo Morales, he's supposed to be a radical leftist, but he runs orthodox macroeconomic policies with a lot of foreign exchange reserves and decent growth rate, and even conservatives have admiration for the way he runs the economy. And the Latin Americans in the past had been hit by external shocks. Like for example, in 1998, when the big funds from Wall Street lost money in Thailand and Korea and Indonesia, what did they do? They just pulled out money from Brazil and Argentina, and these countries went into a crisis. So now the Latin American countries have built firewalls. They have become more resilient and more resistant to these external shocks. That's why in 2008-9, when US had this financial crisis, when Euro collapsed, not a single bank or financial institution in Latin America went bust. They withstood with minor damages. Now the Latin Americans have realized the advantages of collective strength. Apart from individual growth of the countries, now they have realized that there is strength in being together. They have formed groups, you might have heard of Mercosur, Andean Community, something called SICA, which is Central American Integration Community. Now they've got Pacific Alliance. They become stronger. In the external policy, that is their model, but it's imperfect, but that is the direction. They all have their own currency, but they want to have a common currency eventually. This is a long time. Now in foreign policy, Latin America was never a global player. Latin America was a global playing field. Other guys came and played there, first Europeans and then the Americans. And as you might know, it was called as the backyard of the United States. So when the Americans found that the Latin Americans were becoming stronger and stable and also becoming collectively strong, so they didn't like it. So they wanted to disrupt this. So they came with a scheme called free trade area of the Americas, which was proposed by Clinton in 1994. So under that they said from Alaska to Philadelphia it would be one common market. And they started negotiations. But at the beginning, the Americans put two conditions. They said, as soon as we sign this agreement, we should dissolve all these Mercosur and CETA and Andean Community. All these subgroups should be dissolved. And number two, as and when we reach agreement on some issues, they should be implemented immediately without waiting for the entire agreement. Which means that you open your markets for our American products, we will implement it immediately. But when you want our market for your agriculture products, oh, we will wait for it, we will do it later. The typical American negotiation. But for the first time in the 400-year history of Latin America, the Latin Americans put their foot down and told the Americans, no to both. They said, even if we sign this FTA, we will continue with our Mercosur and regional groups. Number two, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So FTA is dead and buried. So a friend of mine from Brazil, he explained, I am the boss. Rule number two, I will do anything I like, I will go anywhere I like, no questions. Rule number three, as and when I come back home, even if it is 2 or 3 in the morning, the food should be ready, warm, on the table, and you should be sitting. So this Brazilian girl, she said, no problems in your life. Since you put 3 conditions, I will put 1 condition. Alright. So she said, you see the bedroom there? There will be sex every night at 10 o'clock, whether you are there or not. So that is the new reality of relations between the United States and Latin America. It's a changed image. And the Latin Americans also undergone a change in their mindset, in their culture. In the past, because of all the uncertainties, crisis and chaos, they never thought about tomorrow. Déjame disfrutar ahora. Mañana puede ser tarde. Dame ahora tu amor. Entregame ahora tu querer. Let me enjoy now. Tomorrow it will be too late. Give me your love now. Deliver your love now. So everything was now, because if you had kept 100 pesos in your pocket, tomorrow it will become only 90 pesos automatically, even without doing anything. So in that kind of uncertainty, people didn't think long term. It was a day-to-day survival. There is a story by one of my favorite writers called Mario Vargas Llosa from Peru. He won the Nobel Prize. There is a novel called Aunt Julia and the Script Writer. In this novel, the hero is a 16-year-old boy. He's going to college. His aunt was married to a Bolivian. And the Bolivian dies, she becomes a widow at the age of 35, and she comes to live in the house of this boy. And she is sad and depressed. So the parents of the boy tell him, aunt is very depressed, why don't you take her out, take her to theatre, park, cinema. He doesn't like it. And then when he tries, she treats him like a kid. And he doesn't like it. But anyway, because the parents put pressure on him, he does it every day. In the course of doing this, the inevitable happens. The boy falls in love with his old aunt. And when he declares his love to her, she says, Don't talk nonsense. How can it be? You are 16-year-old and 54-year-old. You will laugh at it. But the boy is insistent. And he proposes marriage. Say, he'll marry. Again she says, no, it's impractical, it won't work. Your father will come with a gun to shoot both of us. Forget it. But the boy is completely infatuated. They say love is blind. Right? So he insists that I want to marry. So one day, out of sheer frustration, she asks, hey, suppose, hypothetically, we marry. How long do you think we will be happy together before you run away with another young girl? So this young 16-year-old boy, he doesn't think. 2 years. 2 years, she hugs him and embraces him and jumps and dances. 2 years is fantastic, let's marry. If I can have 2 years of happiness, nothing like it. So this was the old Latin America. If you are promised 2 years of happiness, the marriage is worthwhile. You don't think about 7 incarnations. But now that Latin America has changed. Now people think long term, they plan for the long term. So it's different.